Yeah, good afternoon. So it is my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce this first of our sessions in an interdisciplinary series of panels with the theme Transdisciplinary Urbanism in Times of Precarity. I want to welcome you together with Professor Akira Rodriguez, with whom we have applied to this series in an effort to bring a large cluster of faculty, students, and staff to spearhead interdisciplinary conversations in design and its allied artistic and humanistic fields. And we're so happy to begin this conversation today with existing in between spatial precarity in literature and the art. Today's discussion will reflect on questions of literary, artistic, and architectural forms of in-betweenness, with a focus on the Persianate world. The panel will convene 6 speakers with backgrounds as diverse as art, literature, architectural history, poetry, and language. Mikhal Dekel, Salar Abdoh, Fatemeh Shams, Reza Mohammadi, Abdul Bhat, and Illya Mousavijad. I want to welcome you. Today's moderator is my colleague, Professor Shams of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, who I will introduce in just a moment, and she will introduce the speakers. But before I introduce Professor Shams, I would like to say a big thank you to Kelly's Writers House, who's hosting us here today, Jessica Lowenthal, Zach Carduna, and Ali Katz, who have made this digital forum possible. I should also say that all panels in this series are part of a large group effort, and I want to acknowledge the work of Professor Drake Rodriguez, Professor Shams, Jessica Lowenthal, as well as Tiara Campbell and Tosin Ojomola, who has been our research assistant in this series. Please also consider joining us for other upcoming events. Queering Latinx, Latinx Queering, Imagining Inclusive Spaces on March 24th, a collaboration with Casa Latina and the LGBT Center, as well as Environment, Gender, and Crisis on April 8th, with the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. We will also host a panel on designing misinformation in April. So the last thing I should note before I introduce Professor Shams is that we want to thank the Provost's Office Initiative in Excellence Through Diversity and the Dean's Office at the Weizmann School of Design, as well as the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, the Middle East Center, and Kelly Writers House. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Shams. She's a specialist in Persian literature and earned her PhD in Oriental Studies from Oxford University. Her work focuses on the intersection of literature, politics, and society. She's interested in the evolution of poetry and patronage in the Persian literary tradition and the representation and transformation of this relationship in modern Iran. She has published articles and book chapters on poetry, patronage, and politics. And I'm so happy to say that her book, A Revolution in Rhyme, Poetic Co-option under the Islamic Republic, just came out. Congratulations, Fatemeh. I should also say Fatemeh is a spirited teacher who loves her students. So I also want to welcome her students from a poetry seminar she's currently teaching. So I will now hand it over to Professor Shams.
Sophie, thank you so much for that wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you to my colleagues at the Weizmann School of Design and Kelly Writers House for making this panel possible, and also to the Provost Diversity Fund that has generously sponsored this event. I have some brief opening remarks, and then I will hand in the panel to the first group of speakers. I would like to say good afternoon to everyone. As Sophie mentioned, I'm assistant professor of Persian literature at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. and it is a great pleasure to be here alongside colleagues and collaborators from other departments at the university, along with our esteemed panelists who will share their thoughts and ideas with us today. We find ourselves in strange and unpredictable times. Precariousness is no longer an infliction reserved for the exiled, the persecuted, and displaced. Death, loss, separation, and uncertainty are now part of our everyday lives. The exilic state, characterized by disorienting in-betweenness and sense of spatial vulnerability, feels more tangible and relevant than ever before, as we are confined in our arguably safe corners behind our computers, yet still trying to remain virtually connected. Discussing spatial precarity on a virtual space is itself an irony that we did not initially plan for, but in the end, we decided to give it a chance. I organized this panel as part of a spring seminar, advanced seminar in Persian poetry. Some of the key questions that this seminar asks concern the meaning of the term Persian. What is Persian poetry? Which poets and which poems count as Persian and why? How does the spatiality of the poets play into their literary identity and so forth? This is also the first step towards my second book project on imprisonment, exile, and precarious modes of writing. Literary classification, often a fixed and adamantine nomenclature, can struggle over time to keep us with shifting calibrations of geography, language, and identity. The borders that separate today's Iran from Central Asia, Afghanistan, and India may arbitrarily separate the poetic output of Persian-speaking poets. Yet, as Mana Kia eloquently articulates in her recently published book, Persian Itself, they remain united by a linguistic and creative sense of adab, which she defines as proper forms of aesthetic, style, and ethical conduct. Kia insightfully shows us how the people of these regions identified prior to the rise of nation states and colonial era. We see how spatiality plays differently in the formation of Persianate identities between the fall of the Safavid Empire in the early 18th century and the early Qajar era about a century later. Today's panel aims to build up on these insights while moving forward to the era of nation states, where lives both within and outside of national borders have grown to be more precarious than before in the wake of nationalist, racist, and colonialist ideologies. The aim for today's panel is to reflect on various modes of precarity in relation to spatiality in the 20th and 21st centuries. Our session today seeks to illuminate the complex cartography of in-betweenness, liminality, and exile, and create links of commonality between lines on maps or categories on shelves. A new cartography of shared meaning in which Polish Jews fleeing the Holocaust, passing through Tehran on their journey to Israel, share common grounds with the people of Iran, Afghanistan, and India in their precarious modes of existence and constant journeying. Our panelists will reflect on the complex network of emotions that link the precarious life of a war journalist from Iran to the in-between mode of existence experienced by an Afghan immigrant poet, a Kashmiri poet in exile, or a young animation artist from Iran. That said, our panelists will show that not always do we have to leave our homelands to feel exilic and estranged. Sometimes we remain and we decide to constantly escape without the thought of leaving. We choose to live an exilic life within the borders of the homeland and to intervene in this mode with the help of art and literature and architecture, which represents a sense of in-betweenness, otherness, and outsiderness. It imposes a constant tension between conformity and defiance, staying and leaving, freedom within and freedom without. The diverse work of our panelists today speaks to the multiplicity of this spatial precarity, as revealed in literature, art, and architecture. How do we each find meaning and assert our individual personhoods, either away from our homeland or within the confines of a homeland that does not feel like home? How can we express the often inarticulable complexity of that experience in our work without the work itself being diluted by external categorization and labels? I have posted the webinar schedule for everyone in the chat section, and you can see how the seminar has been scheduled for today. So the way it works is that we will have two presentations on each panel, and then after the presentation, so there won't be time after each presentation, but after each two presentations, 15 minutes for the speakers to reflect on the panelists' presentations. You are welcome to post, and this is addressing our attendees in the seminar, that you can post your questions in the chat section only within those 15 minutes for each panel, and then we will have another extra 15 minutes at the end of the seminar, webinar, for you to ask questions. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our second speaker, and one of the main goals of this panel has been to put into conversation our graduate students from University of Pennsylvania, some of the most distinguished ones, with our speakers, who are leading scholars and creative writers and poets in the field. So, and that's how the panels have been planned. So our second speaker is Illya Mousavijad, and I'm trying to, yes. That I would like to just add a couple of points before his introduction. He's going to show his wonderful animation today. And on that note, I would like to bring to the fore what Stephen Kern wrote once about space being a form of understanding and not just an objective reality. And that space is not only a basic category of human existence, but a way of thinking about that existence. This shifting attitude towards space and the urge for the invention of a new space convention brought animation to the artistic and as an artistic form to the attention of the artists and the art critics of the 20th and 21st century as an artistic form that offers a new psychological interpretation of space. Illya is an emerging multidisciplinary conceptual artist born and raised in Isfahan in Iran. He received his BFA at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA, and he's currently pursuing his MFA at Weizmann School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. His art practice investigates the limits and extents of exile, border, and identity politics, Middle Eastern history, exile literature, and US-Iran relations. His works across varied media, including installation, painting, video, and computer animation, and he has collaborated with international artists of various disciplines and exhibited in Iran, who exhibited in Iran and the United States. Illya is currently based in Philadelphia. I had the pleasure of being his mentor in the past. And it's wonderful to have you here, Illya. We can't wait to watch your animation.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude and saying that it is really expressing how much of an honor it is for me to be among you, this wonderful panel, and also especially thank all the attendants. I would like to read a passage as an introduction to this work, and then I will share the animation piece that then we can watch together. Everyone can hear my sound, right? Okay. Spatial precarity and animation as artistic form. In English, animation derives from the word animal. The nomination seems as superficial as to say movie, that simply recalls pictures in movement. But how is it to animate and how is it to move? I take my body to the desk, turn on the computer, turn on a machine, open a software, a space with its many folds of engineered possibilities. I stare at the screen, a window to a calculated void, an illuminated void. It is a place without walls, grounds, or skies. I have nothing here. I must make everything from scratch. Should I make a plane, a horizon, light, maybe some wind? Should I model a pot and put a transparent red liquid in it as though it is wine? This is a place for no one. I don't belong to it. I only grow used to its components. I learn how to make vain objects and calculate collisions. Time can be made, stretched, constrained, and compressed. Existence relies on electricity and engineering. Resolution exists in a scale. My world is constructed from intangible numbers. There is no particular sense of loss, but perhaps a continuous sense of floating. I am continuously losing and reappearing. My production is a kind of externalization within inconclusive brackets. Reflection on the spatial precarity comes accompanied with a constant contemplation on the linguistic limitations. Language as a space which could be lost as one goes through an exilic journey. In Farsi, the equivalent of quote, I miss you is quote, Delam barat tang shode, which literally translates to my heart is constricted for you. It appears that to literally say missing something in Farsi, gum kardan, in quote, does not come with a sense of emotional, medical, and spatial constraint. The constriction of heart is a self-conscious existence in a space that is in between inward pushing forces. The experience of becoming displaced and unfit within oneself. Animation for me has been a way to reconstruct an imaginary space as an equivalent of a lost homeland and a deteriorating mother tongue. To provide a little context for my animation work, on the 20th October 2019, I found myself drinking shots of whiskey with Faris Al-Ghazal. What was illegal in Iran was cheap in Queens. It was a strange time and space. I had met Faris earlier that fall, an international cook from Jordan. His immigration status in the US was approaching expiration. It appeared as though his entire life was on an edge. He had lost his job that day, which only added to the bitterness of the situation. The house we were in belonged to another two friends of mine, a couple from Macedonia and China. Those friends and I had started a teaching business in Queens. That summer, they traveled to Macedonia to renew their residential status in the US. The American embassy had put them on a several-month-long hold. Later that fall, the embassy rejected their case and they never came back. During those months, I had helped move their house in their absence and in the anticipation of their return. The new place was packed with boxes and all sorts of displaced belongings. Then and there I was sitting and drinking with yet another misfortunate exile in the middle of a big mess. We were both depressed and used to feeling that way. Faris was excited when he learned I was an Iranian student. Somehow that fact automatically created all the necessary means for a connection. He offered me whiskey and said, cheers. Was it pain, familiarity, sympathy? I was so occupied thinking, what was it that we were celebrating? I began remembering the poem Hochhaeusl by Ilyas Alavi, where an Afghan and a Kurd happened to connect with each other, connect with the Russian Araq in Soleimania. I felt the existence of something valuable between all those loose links. I reached for my notebook, but I realized I was too drunk for a coherent writing task. So I pulled out my phone and started voice recording. I had to capture that moment and only wished it was possible to record my drunken mind as well. As I continued to sink in alcohol and poetry, we had already talked so much about politics and all the sort of Middle Eastern mess one can talk about. Faris suddenly began expressing his love for Omar Khayyam. I burst out of excitement. Why did he mention Khayyam? We spoke of Khayyam's rubaiyat. His Sufi wisdom and philosophy somehow manifested in a Persian poetic structure that only allows for 4 lines. The embodiment of human flesh and memory in the soil, where we all dissolve in after we die. The temporality of existence and the arbitrariness of our identity, place, and time. The fact that we never know where we are going and when our journey concludes. The fact that birth and death are the only certainties. Manipulated between one court to another palace, exile was only normal for Persian poets. Mobility and freedom suppressed by unpredictable power. The same existential observations felt so tangible 1,000 years later. So I am going to share my animation.
Shot after shot, a drunk collection. Perhaps it isn't without reason that alcohol is prohibited. We have had way too much of it already. I am talking to you, and through you, words, images, bodily matter. You're confusing to me, but I am used to confusion. Confusion is the key to meaning, a key that doesn't work, but it renders, render after render, on top of each other, on top of itself, on top of me, with negation and addition. A sequence of information, a sequence of definition, an accumulation of contradiction. A series of missings that you have to find still and redo. Always a chain of bitter sips. The poison and the imagination of cure. The answer to the wrong question. Do you understand? Do you understand? Having to understand obscurities and getting used to doing a bad job. The punishment and the blame that comes with it. It all becomes a habit, an unfamiliar space that is familiar, fallen in the cracks. Tiptoe, tiptoe, tiptoe. A crude reality, a fragile reception, believable lies, inevitable lies, necessary lies, beautiful lies. It knows you're limited on storage and that you're not loyal and that you don't save, so it visits you enough. Memorize, remember, memorize, remember, memorize, remember, memorize, remember, memorize, remember, memorize, remember, memorize, remember.
You know his name is Omar al-Khayyam.
Khayyam, yeah. Omar Khayyam.
Omar al-Khayyam,
Yeah.
he is my favorite. Yeah. Omar al-Khayyam is so...
It's so funny, you know, I've been thinking of making an animation about
Omar
one of his poems, yeah.
Oh,
He talks
okay.
about walking into, I'm sure you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Don't pour too much for me, just
A little bit. Okay, tell us.
so he talks about for example walking into that pottery shop, right? And there are thousands of vases and pots of of different types on shelves, right? And
He said about the kings.
yeah, the head of the king and the hand of the beggar and
Fuck you, man.
Yeah.
So man.
and then but then he realizes he comes to his conscious in a way, like, and he realizes that he can't distinguish between the customers and the sellers in the shop
Yeah.
and the pots, right? So like the people, the actual people, including the customers and the sellermen, are to him merging
Yeah.
with the vases, with the pots. They're like, what's the difference? It's a pot
Yeah.
and it's a human,
Yeah.
flesh and ceramic.
Okay, in my version of a story, he has a poem.
Great, thank you very much, Illya, for this wonderful presentation. I had the pleasure to watch this beautiful animation for the second time. We have about 6 to 7 minutes before our first break for questions for our panelists. I would like to, before I, abuse my power as the chair discussant, I would like to see if our other speakers have anything to ask, have any questions for our two wonderful panelists, Pamela and Illya. Caitlin Hogan has a question about, we don't have much time, so Illya, I would be grateful if you be very brief. Please, how did you create this animation piece? It felt at times that it was produced with immersive virtual reality programs. Very technical question.
Yeah. Yes, this animation was produced with Autodesk Maya, which is a computer animation software and has been around, I think, since 1998 or so. And it's one of the industry lead softwares for creating virtual spaces. You can use it to create models, architectural models, and collisions, animation collisions, and shades and textures. And so it has it's a very very expansive software and very capable for making these spaces.
Sophie also had a very interesting analysis of your work, Illya, and I just want to quickly add, since we are on this topic before going for a short break, that your work, Illya, reminded me of Spengler's, a point on how different cultures have a unique sense of space. What you do in this animation is to connect two different spatialities, right? The spatiality of a Jordanian chef who just lost his job, and with the spatiality of an immigrant student from Iran, and both share the precarity of being an immigrant and living on the edge, as you beautifully described it. When you were making your work, your animation, how did you think about this shared space? And what was the challenge of connecting your spatiality with that of your Jordanian friend? And how animation as an artistic form allowed you to overcome this challenge that, for example, painting doesn't, because you are a wonderful painter also.
Yes, I think that my problem with painting grew with my hesitance and problems that I started having with my reality, and that partially is economical and partially is physically spatial. So I think I just at some point didn't have more room to paint, and I also didn't really trust my reality in many ways, because I have been, well, in many ways displaced and moved from one location to another. So material form has become a problem, and animation, what is incredible about the computer animation is that it is a very, I think, exilic space to begin with, and that is because it's very it's not grounded. It's a very groundless place, and so you don't, as an artist, practicing artist, you're not walking into a room, whether it's the white box of the gallery or your studio, with where a lot of physical things are taken as granted. Nothing is taken as granted in the animation world. So I have to literally create everything. And I think there is something quite uncanny about all the relationships objects can have with each other in that world on a surreal level, abiding reality only partially, basically. So I don't. Is that
yes,
answer?
That's great. And hopefully at the end of today's panel, when we have more time for the discussions, you can possibly also elaborate on why, I know that why you chose Khayyam, but how Khayyam's poetics, particularly about pottery and wine drinking, was something that you thought in animation would sort of, come through so beautifully as you have worked on it. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for this engaging conversation. We are 10 minutes behind the schedule. We were supposed to have a 10-minute break before our next panel. I will have to make that break shorter. So we will have only 5 minutes, and then we are back for our second panel, which is going to be equally fascinating and I hope very exciting. We have a guest, a wonderful dear guest from Kabul, Afghanistan, Reza Mohammadi, one of the pioneering and leading voices of today's Iran and Afghanistan poetry. Thank you, Reza Jan, for being with us from Afghanistan, from Kabul. I know that it's very late there. You're 9 hours ahead of us. So we are going to make this panel sort of we end it here, and then we will be back in 5 minutes. And we also have Abdul Manan, one of our greatest PhD candidates at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Department of Religious Studies, with whom I have the pleasure of working on his PhD dissertation along with my esteemed colleague, Professor Jamal Ilyas. So I'll see you in 5 minutes, and we have 2 great poets who are going to read for us. See you in a bit. Great, so welcome back, everyone. For this panel, we will move from architectural design and performing art and visual art into verbal art, poetry. And as I was reading Hafez earlier today to see what he suggests as an opening line for the poetry panel, as an Iranian, a Persian speaker does, the wonderful ghazal came up with the opening line, Sarv chaman man chera meil chaman nemi konad, hamdam gul nemi shavad, yad saman nemi konad, and which he knows exactly how I feel these days. And then there is a wonderful line in this ghazal, since one of our poets is going actually to recite ghazal, I thought it's only appropriate to start with a line in the ghazal that also has to do with Vatan, the homeland. And the line goes, Ta dil harze gard man raft be chin zulf ou, zan safar deraz khod azm safar nemi konad. Once my Wagner heart entered the twist of the beloved curl, because of its long journey, it does not make for its native place. Sometimes love doesn't want you to go back to where you belong. And that's where I think the spatiality, the suspension, the exilic mode makes sense. I just want to add to this a few points about the importance and relevance of poetry to the discussion about space and spatiality and precarity. Are both speakers who speak to this idea, but I just wanted to mention that before the emergence of the print culture in the Middle East, particularly in the Persianate world, which is our today's focus, poetry was the time art. And in the Persianate world, as those of us who come from the Middle East and also in the Arab tradition and the Hebrew tradition, memorizing and performing poetry have always highlighted the unique spatiality of the spatial quality of poetry as a verbal performative art, which occupies space in both memory as well as the society. And as the literary critic and poet, the British scriptwriter Ian Davidson notes, due to our increasingly spatialized world, notions of place and notions of poetry will also have to change, and we have to also speak to the idea of space when we talk poetry. And my hope is that our today's speakers touch upon this relationship between the spatiality of the poet and poetry in relation to the outside world. I would like to invite our first poet, Reza Mohammadi, for his reading. Reza is a widely recognized voice of today's poetry of Afghanistan as well as Iran, and I would like to emphasize on this because it has to do with the challenging the notions of national borders very much. And he was born in Kandahar in 1979. He studied Islamic law and then philosophy in Iran before obtaining an MA in globalization from London Metropolitan University. He has so far published 3 collections and received a number of awards from Afghan Ministry of Culture in 2004. He was recognized as Iran's best young poet in 1996 and 1997. He is also a prolific journalist in Persian and English, and he has published numerous articles in Iran and Afghanistan, as well as The Guardian and New Yorker. Reza has joined us from Kabul, and I would like to especially thank you, Reza, for making the time. I know it's late there, so I'm going to be brief here, and we would love to hear you.
Yeah, hello to everyone, and thanks to you, Professor Shams. I know actually you're a great poet as well. As you said, those who know about Persian language know the importance of poetry in this language. The city of Ghazni, when I was born, is a city famous for poetry. Once there were 700 poets in the royal court in 11th and 12th century. Imagine how many poets used to be at the city at the time, that 700 of them were selected to be in royal court. Now there is well, Ghazni is a city of poetry, but surely not like before. There is no any royal court. There is no any royal poet. Poetry changed a little bit to Sophie style, and poets live quietly at the city's corner everywhere. But anyway, still poets are holy people, holy gods for people of Ghazni, who are inspired by God. And another point is people in Ghazni speak to each other more poetic than other cities in Persian lands. You can find the metaphors, you can find poetic language in their daily conversations. And because of this, I remember when I was a child, tens of people every single night were gathering at the back yard of our castle to recite poetry, mostly verses from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. It is a very important book, important poetry book to Persian people. Mostly they compare it to Illya and Odyssey by Homer, and also by Ghazaliyat Hafiz, Ghazal by Hafiz of Shiraz, the symbolic poet of Persian language, and Sadi from Shiraz, another poet from Shiraz, and Maulana Balkhi, who is famous in the West by the name of Rumi. Also by posh people and elite and nobles have their own poetry books. For example, Dekel of Delhi, a Persian poet from India in, I think, 16th century or 15th century, who is very popular in Afghanistan, especially among elites and posh people. When I was 5 years old, I was sent to learn Hafiz, Divan of Hafiz, collection poems of actually of legendary Hafiz. And after 1 year, I memorized all the book. It was coincided with the war between Islamic jihadis and communist parties in Afghanistan. Many people were fleeing Afghanistan from Afghanistan to other countries. We escaped to Iran. In the Mashhad, a city in the east of Iran, Mashhad is a city of poetic associations. We had every single night one association to attend and to recite our poems and to listen to other poets. The good point about Afghan immigrants in Iran is they couldn't join political parties. They couldn't join politics at all in Iran. Because of this, we had the chance, we had an opportunity to be friends with different people of Iran, with communists, with postmoderns, with Islamists, with revolutionary people, with anti-revolutionary people. And it was actually a very special experience for only Afghan immigrants in Iran, because they could experience different societies of Iran. Everyone who know Iran, they know that there are 10 kind of Irans live in one Iran, in one country, 10 different societies. And maybe it's a bit difficult for Iranians to, cross the border from one society to another society. But for us, as Afghan immigrants, it was easier. There was a group of poets in Mashhad. They believed the poets should escape from modern cities. They should go far to mountains and be with nature. I joined them when I was 16 or 17. 5 months to 6 months I've been with them. All the nights we used to pray, and during the day we used to work in the nature. We used to learn how to speak with the clouds, how to speak with the winds, how to speak with the sky and listen to the sky. After a while, my family realized that I got crazy. Because of this, they chained me to a holy shrine in a graveyard to be free from this madness. I started studying to enter university. At the first year of university, I was nearly famous poet. I had daily interviews actually with the media and some good job offers from very prestigious newspapers. And most importantly, I was being invited to nobles' houses, to the houses of very important people, posh, political, and maybe government people. But anyway, actually, it was a unique experience for me because I've been a Persian poet, and I wasn't Iranian. I was foreigner, and I wasn't foreigner in Iran. These different and special experiences made me a different person, made me a different poet. My poems are exactly like myself, like my life. As you know, at that time, I had actually two different lives. My life actually had two different phases, bad phase and good phase. The good phase is I had trust of nobles, and the bad phase, I hadn't trust of police. Many times I was arrested by police and imprisoned in immigrant camps. It was like prisons. But at the time, poetry was my life. Poetry, I was tied with poetry. I remember at the prison, I was reciting my poems loudly. Prisoners and soldiers both used to gather to listen to my poems. I have been, I used to be, kind of experiencing poetry, living poetry, or live with poetry. And at the same time, I wasn't allowed to enter political issues in Iran. I used to be neutral with different political ideas. Normally, actually, Iranian people wouldn't let me into their groups in political discussions. And my poems as well are neutral in politics. I try to be neutral in my life and in my poetry. I used to be a stateless poet in Iran, foreigners and not completely native, no foreigners. When I returned to Afghanistan, it used to be the same. In Afghanistan as well, I was a kind of foreigner in my motherland. My accent was Iranian. My attitude was different to people of my motherland. But when I moved to London, it helped me to bridge between two different communities, to bridge between Iranian and Afghan societies in London. We had actually some poetry gatherings in London for both societies, for both communities, because both of them have been foreigners in United Kingdom. The point in my living in UK is when I had readings in different cities of UK. It happened to me many times that people ask me, do you know Bin Laden? Do you have any connection with Bin Laden? They even didn't know Bin Laden is not from Afghanistan. Bin Laden is not even Persian. He was Arab, I think, half from Saudi Arabia, half from Yemen. But anyway, they believe there is a connection between an Afghan poet and Bin Laden because Afghanistan was famous with Bin Laden. Once I've been in Wales for a poetry reading. A poet from Wales invited us to his house, and he said about Ted Hughes' idea. Ted Hughes says poets are from same tribe, from one tribe. They live in the different corners of the world, but they belong to one tribe because they understand themselves. Only poets understand poets. I have a poem, Shoes. It's about two pair of shoes who had different journeys, different histories, and different stories, and they joined together in front of a house and telling to each other their stories. It is about this experience, the experience of living between different countries with different societies. And at the end, I found after these long journeys in different countries and different societies that people need poetry, especially at this machine age. Poetry can save people. Poetry can save us as long as people are in need to dreams and wishes and freedom. They are in need of poetry. Poetry is more than important, especially at this time for humankind. And let me read my poem I mentioned. Yeah, the pair of shoes in Persian. ما کفش‌های چرمی هم بودیم وقتی کنار در همراه میشویم از خاطرات همدیگر آگاه میشویم در خاطرات تو گوساله است رومی پروار گفته های خدایان پروار نقل پروار دور باطل تاریخ از زندگی به مرگ، از سفسطه به عقل. آنگاه با رومیان رواق آمده به بغل. پس از تو پادشاهی کفشی درست کرده، هدیه نموده است به درویشی. من بچه گوزنی بودم به کاشغر، در حمله مغول به خراسان سپر شدم. در بلخ کاغذ سبق، در بامیان علم، در غزنه زیر دست یکی کفشگر شدم. دزدی مرا خرید. تو از زمان کفش شدن تا این زمان درست به اندازه مانده‌ای. درویش و نسل‌های پسین هرگز تو را ندیده نپوشیدن، تو تازه مانده‌ای. من اما با دزدهای مختلفی راه رفتم. دزدان مرا زمان به زمان، شب به شب با خود گرفتند و به اینجا کشیدند. اینک من و تو همراه از خاطرات همدیگر آگاه. اینک من و تو ما کفش‌های چرمی هم هستیم. متشکرم. Thank you.
Wow. Reza's performance at any time, every time he recites a poem, it's just simply breathtaking. Thank you so much, Reza, for this wonderful, also prologue to your poem. I think you just put so many things into context and into perspective as far as how today's panel is concerned. I'm sure our speakers, I know my students have questions for you right after our second poet recites his poetry. So I will just, without further ado, introduce our second poet. Abdul Manan Bhat is a PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he works on Islamic literature, Sufism, and performance of poetry in the 20th century. More specifically, he explores how modern Urdu and Persian poetry and its performance relates to Islamic meaning-making. Abdul Manan is also an Urdu poet and writes under the pen name Alam. His poetry, Alam. His poetry has been translated into English and Italian, sung by prominent singers in Kashmir, and he has recited at various international forums, including Times Literature Festival in London. He's currently based in Philadelphia. He's going to read for us, and he's also going to give us an introduction to what spatiality and poetry means to him. Please, Abdul.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And this has already been such a wonderful gathering. And Dr. Shams, you began with the Hafiz Ghazal, and I was reminded as we are sitting in this liminal space of that famous line, Kujadan and Halema, Subak Baran Sahilha. We're all, what do the light-headed, shored ones know of our state? I think we're all, none of us is on a shore. And so I again, thank you all for being here. Poetry treads a tense line. It happens somewhere between exactitude and inexactitude. Words and silences between the worlds that it creates and the ones that it inhabits. In other words, poetry is a precarious endeavor. Is poetry itself a space of precarity? And do we derive a haunting pleasure from knowing that a syllable here or a word there, one more image, one less adjective, and the poem will undo itself? Is there a perennial threat of falling over the cliff of meaning, or the cliff of feeling? Perhaps this is what amazed Parhez when he marveled When we close our books at night, why don't words fall off the page? Poems are so delicate, and yet they never fall off the proverbial page. Beginning with the premise that poems are themselves spaces of precarity, I'll talk about the poetics of precarity in the Persianate ghazal tradition through its three inhabitants: Mirza Sadullah Khan Ghalib, Muhammad Iqbal, and Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Not to suggest that these are the singular visions of precarity in each of these poets. There are numerous other visions within each of them, sometimes aligned, sometimes in stark opposition. As Ghalib famously said, "Mutaqabil hai muqabil mera, ruk gaya dekh rawani meri." That opposition itself is stunned at Ghalib's fluency, at the smoothness that makes all oppositions not only desirous, but also spectacular. And with that spirit. Now, more generally, the ghazal as a form builds upon spatial asymmetry between the lover and the beloved. In the most sweeping of terms, it's the beloved absence, which is to say, his or her being in another place, that gives the impetus for the poetic voice to emerge. Thus begins a quest for union, that unattainable yet inviting thing, unrivaled in madness, always ephemeral, always precarious. I chose these poets because their work is an occasion to briefly explore the different trends of precarity in the Persianate ghazal tradition. They take us to different sites of precarity: the universe, the human self, and the prison. Ghalib, deemed by many of his admirers and detractors a master of abstractions, takes the universe as a space as well as a sign of precarity. Ghalib, also known by his other pen name, Asad, expresses wonder and sometimes even pokes fun at the fragility of the universe. And he claims to look through its supposed vastness to see it for what it is, a raucous and precarious spectacle. Hasti ke mat fareb mein aa jaiyo Asad, alam tamam halqae dame khayal hai. Don't be beguiled by existence, Asad. The entire world is a knot in the net of imagination. Or when he says, hai aadmi bajaye khud ek mahshar-e khayal, hum anjuman samajhte hain, khalwat hi kyun na ho. A human, instead of himself, is the thought's tumultuous rise. We fancy it a gathering, even if it would be plain solitude. Meaning, a human is not a self, but a cacophony of thought. Nothing but a gathering of thoughts whose tumult resembles doomsday, as if thoughts are having a doomsday of their own, and the product of that noise is the idea of a human. Not only do we conjure ourselves, we also manage to convince ourselves that we are in a gathering, that there is a world out there. When we are only in the intimate presence of ourselves. In another instance, Ghalib points to the universe's precarious logic in an almost childlike wonder. Na tha kuch to khuda tha, kuch na hota to khuda hota, duboya mujhko hone ne, na hota main to kya hota. When there was nothing, there was God. Had there not been anything, there would have been God. Being cursed me. Had I not been, what would have been? The noted Persian and Urdu poet Iqbal recognized another space of precarity, the human self. I use the word space intentionally because Iqbal's vision of the universe is invested in the human self. Our selfhood, we call khudi, is like a space that contains numerous currents and countercurrents, which for Iqbal is a sign of great potential, but also something that requires urgent attention. The human self is precarious not because it is fragile, but because it is too powerful, and therefore must be attended to. ये पैगाम दे गई है मुझे बाद सुबह गाही कि खुदी के आरिफों का है मकाम बादशाही तेरी जिंदगी इसी से तेरी आबरू इसी से जो रही खुदी तो शाही न रही तो रूसियाही. The morning breeze has left me a message that the knowers of selfhood are king-like. Your life, your dignity, both are from selfhood. With it, kingship abounds. Without it, disgrace. There is no alternative, no middle ground. The human self cannot be left alone, but one ought to tread the precarious tightrope between total action and total abandon. Iqbal also turns the gaze toward poets and alarms them that they ought to be the voice that reminds the human self of its urgent potential. The poet is bound in a double precarity of realizing the potential of the human self as well as of the poet self. با این بهانه در این بزم محرمی جویم غزل سرایم و پیغام آشنا گویم, says Iqbal. I look for a confidant in this gathering, for I recite ghazals and share a known message. And the latest of these poets, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who passed away in 1984, takes note of the precarity of the universe and the self to declare the tiresome and testing exilic condition as precarious. Exile causes him pain and suffering, but he sees its very existence to be contingent, which is to say, exile ought to end because it is held up by one tyrant or another. And for Faiz, all tyrants, as his famous line goes, the mountains, all tyrants, like the mountains of cruelty, will wither away like specks of cotton. Dil mein yun tere khoye hue gham aate hain, jaise bichde hue Kabe mein sanam aate hain. The sorrows of you return to my heart as if the exiled idols return to the Kaaba. Writing from prison, consider Faiz's certitude. Garaj juda hain to kal baham honge. Ye raat bhar ki judai to koi baat nahi. Today we are apart, tomorrow we'll be together. This one night keeps us away, just this one inconsequential night. Though there is a recognition of what is a fragmented chronology, Faiz's attempt is to almost negate it, is to almost suggest that, like he says, it's just one inconsequential night. Exile is not a cosmic condition for Faiz, for it is not the ordained final destination for us human beings. The final destination for Faiz is not to be imprisoned in exile, but to be free in order to wander. In much of Faiz's poetry, the vast desert, a metonym for exile as well as the space in which exile plays out, blends into the prison, another metonym for the forced separation. Prison too is an exile, desolate, lonely, haunting, and temporary, just like the desert. For Faiz, the exilic desert is a prison, and the prison an exilic desert. Maqam Faiz koi raah mein jacha hi nahi, jo kuए yaar se nikle to suedar chale. Faiz, there is no in between that suits us, from the beloved's alleyway to the gallows. For each of them, however, the space of precarity is a position of possibilities, an impetus to creative action. Ghalib, Iqbal, and Faiz hold on to the precarity of the poetic space in order to unravel the many other precarities, of the precarity of the universe, of ourselves, and of the many tyrants that surround us. I too imagine my own poetic voice to emerge from a similar position of precarious possibilities. Before I go on to recite the poem, I just wanted to say, when I heard Pamela's fabulous presentation, and there was this very striking image of the art piece of a man hanging upside down. I thought I'd share a couplet of mine that I'd like to dedicate to all of us here, because there's a reason I think in the couplet it'll get reveal why I'm doing that. And it's just one couplet before I move on to the ghazal. Dekha chaman ki aur to jalta shajar dekha. Dekha chaman ki aur to jalta shajar dekha. Matlab yahan hai aur bhi mehve safar koi. It means, I looked to the garden and saw a tree burning. I looked to the garden and saw a tree burning, which means someone else too is a traveler now. Many of our trees are burning as we speak, and I feel many of us are then rendered to be travelers, and thus dedicating my following poems to our fellow travelers, which is all of us, I'll share the ghazal. I'll read it in Urdu and then I'll read the English translations, which are by my very good friend and translator, Partha. हम चल रहे हैं साये दीवार से जुदा, अहदे जफा में खलवते रुखसार से जुदा. हम चल रहे हैं साये दीवार से जुदा, अहदे जफा में खलवते रुखसार से जुदा. किस चार अगर से हमको हो उम्मीद जान के जब, किस चार अगर से हमको हो उम्मीद जान के जब, रस्मे दवा है सीनाए बीमार से जुदा. हम जो गए तो सूने ही रह जाएंगे ये सब, जिंदान कच खुला सजावार से जुदा. अब दर्द दिल की वहशतों का रंग और है, अब दर्द दिल की वहशतों का रंग और है, गुलफाम से जुदा लब रुखसार से जुदा. क्यों अर्ज़ मुद्दआ को मुनसिफों में बैठिए, क्यों अर्ज़ मुद्दआ को मुनसिफों में बैठिए, कोई नहीं रहा है गुनहगार से जुदा. वो रंग जो अपनी क़बाए खाक में खिलें, वो रंग जो अपनी क़बाए खाक में खिलें, जचते नहीं हैं कूचाए दिलदार से जुदा. जचते नहीं हैं कूचाए दिलदार से जुदा. And I'll just end with my last poem, which and I don't think I need to read the translations because I feel we can see them. I just want to be on time, so I think that's in everybody's interest. तन्हा नहीं है तू जाने जा, तेरे साथ शब का करार है. तन्हा नहीं है तू जाने जा, तेरे साथ शब का करार है. तेरे गेसुओं के फिराक में कई अंजुमों की कतार है. कई अब्र हैं सरे आसमां, कई दश्त ज़ेरे नकाब हैं, कई काफिले हैं थके थके, हर सिमत गम के सराब हैं. कुछ बस्तियां हैं हुस्न की जहाँ हिज्र के बीमार हैं, कई बेवफा हैं छुपे हुए, कई दोस्तों के मजार हैं. तेरी उंगलियों पे चले फिजा, नक्श पा में बसे सबा. तन्हा नहीं है तू जाने जा, तेरे साथ शब का करार है. तेरे गेसुओं के फिराक में कई अंजुमों की कतार है. इसी रोशनी में है जिंदगी, जरा जिंदगी से नजर मिला. जरा बात कर कुछ गुनगुना, मेरे दोस्त मेरे करीब आ. तन्हा नहीं है तू जाने जा, तेरे साथ शब का करार है. तेरे गेसुओं के फिराक में कई अंजुमों की कतार है, कई अंजुमों की कतार है. Thank you so much.
That was so wonderful. Thank you, Abdul Manan, for that great prologue to your poetry reading as well. Thank you so much. So we are still running out of, running behind the schedule, 10 minutes, the very first 10 minutes. We are still behind the schedule. So I would like to only dedicate 5 minutes to questions for our two poets, and then move on to the next panel, if possible. One of my students, Sarah, is going to ask a question. I'm just going to unmute her since I would love my students to be engaged with the poets since this is part of the seminar. So, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much to both of you for your wonderful poems. I really enjoyed. I have two questions actually for Reza. The first one, in your poems, Reza, especially regarding the lines starting from, let me see, I was a baby elk in China. The Mongols made a shield of me. Until you mention the line, up to present time remain the same. So I wonder if you could tell us, if there was a particular moment in your life as an immigrant that is kind of tied to these lines, and you can bring them up. And my second question to you is that you mentioned that you were a stateless poet, both foreign in Iran and Afghanistan. So how did you encounter this being of stateless poet? And to what extent did this help you? Did this statelessness help you in the formation of your identity, your poetic identity?
Reza Jan, if you can be brief, please, since we don't have much time, so I appreciate that. We have also more questions from students. You're on mute. Reza, you're on mute.
Yeah, but shortly I need to answer. It happens actually a lot to me. As I said, when actually I am with an Iranian friend, we had two different journeys in our lives. When I been actually with an English poet, as well actually we had two different journeys. Yeah, we are from same tribe. We are at the same time, at the same place, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand each other, even we are from same tribe. It's the first question. The next one, as Dr. Shams said, I'm a Persian poet. It means that when actually I am in Iran, they call me Afghan poet. When I'm in Afghanistan, they call me more Iranian. I'm stateless in Persian lands, but anyway, I'm a Persian poet. That I feel I'm from Tajikistan, from Afghanistan, and from Iran, but I live in Kabul.
Great, thank you. And my next student, Emily, she's going to ask a question. Emily, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much again for sharing your poems. And actually, I have a question for both speakers, because just speaking about the precarity and how like deeply personal like the struggle of composition is, and I was quite moved by hearing both of your poems. I mean, I read them before, but really hearing them. And so I'm curious as to how you feel about like nowadays when poetry is so freely propagated, the process of sharing it is so different than like how these ancient forms originated. How you feel about how you would like your poetry to be shared and like how it is being shared today.
Thank you, Emily. If each of, maybe Abdul Manan, if you can start, and then Reza, you can follow briefly.
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for the question. It is, of course, anyone who recites in the Persianate tradition, particularly, would acknowledge that there's a very important part that the audience plays. When I say audience, I mean audience in a room. So, especially in the Urdu poetic tradition, often called the Mushaira, for example, where it is quite unlike, readings that happen either in Europe or in America. Even within pockets, when you see Urdu poetry happening, the audience plays a very lively role. The audience interrupts. The audience, creates almost a ruckus, and that's almost the ruckus is seen. It feeds into the poet's energy, right? So the audience will interrupt and say, again. They're asked to repeat again, right? And so the poet has to repeat, and there's this constant. So of course that I miss, and that's something. But then there's a lot of things we miss about the lives prior to what we are. But if I were to treat this, I'll just briefly say, this was on a more pragmatic level. But I think on a more conceptual plane, I feel that at least I tend to think, there's that idea, I think the Lacani, the very good example, that if you write a letter and you don't send it, you've sent it anyways, right? So there is also this idea that when you write a poem, especially a poem like the Ghazal, which the form itself is so attuned to the pleasure of the listener, there's almost always a listener. I live alone, but there's almost always a listener in that sense. The form itself lends, particularly the Ghazal, it lends itself to, in its very composition, to imagine how it lands not just in someone's ear, but on their bodies, how it lands on their bodies, what kind of pleasures does it evoke, and thoughts that not just thoughts, but pleasures it evokes. So I feel like, yeah, these are two, I'll stop there.
You're muted, Fatemeh.
Sorry, I'm going to unmute my student, Fateh, who has a question for Reza.
Thank you very much, Reza, for sharing your beautiful poem. And thank you very much, Abdul, as well. In Reza's poem, I can really see the shoes alive. I can see the journey of the shoes, both reflecting upon your own journey and the journey of the Iranian and Afghan communities in London, and the happiness to be united once again. However, I noticed that the journey of yours is one filled with unfortunate events. The shoe gets damaged on this journey. Whereas the journey of the London-based Iranians and the London-based Afghanis was of loneliness, but they are still intact and they seem almost happier. And you seem to emphasize a little more about your series of misfortunate events. Do you mind reflecting on how the London-based Iranians and Afghanis reflect on your misfortunes, and perhaps how you reflect upon the more slightly fortunate experiences of those communities in London?
Actually, it's a bit difficult to answer the question. Sometimes, it's very difficult to answer this. Poetry in the Persian language doesn't belong to poet itself. It belongs to audience, it belongs to people. Everyone can share the poem, depending on the own experiences, on their, on the perspective of life. And when you read a poem for a Persian audience, every single one in the hall, in the clip, in the audience, can feel the poem, by their own. For everyone, actually, there's a different meaning, and mostly it's not the same, but what the poet wanted to say. Yeah.
Thank you to all the speakers, and I wonder if there's any question from our other panelists for the two poets. Since we don't have time, probably do your best to move on to the next panel. And we are running behind the schedule, so if we are not going to have a second break, simply because Professor Dekel was supposed to start at 3:30, and her students, her class, like my own class, have also joined the discussion. So welcome to Professor Dekel's students. Whoever would like to take a break to go and refresh, please do so. We are going to continue to the next panel. And in order to put into context and for the students, for Professor Dekel's student, this panel is about the spatial precarity in art and literature and architecture. And the reason that I was keen on including Mikhal's work in this panel was because I think her work speaks really well to this concept. And the story of Mikhal's remarkable book, Tehran Children, A Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, is really one which is seldom told. It is not just a gripping memoir, but also a timely and important work of social history that documents the exodus of the Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust by taking the road east into the Soviet Union and from there to Tehran and then to Israel. In recounting the harrowing journey of her father's escape from Poland, Mikhal relived the precarious lives of not just the Polish Jews, but so many more refugees around the world. As the author Samuel Moyn writes in his endorsement of Mikhal's book, this is a brilliantly conceived narrative in which Mikhal illuminates a series of unexpected places absent from many maps of the refugee experience of the Holocaust, including Tehran in Iran. Mikhal Dekel is a professor of comparative literature and Middle East studies at CUNY Graduate Center and the City College of New York, where she also directs the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including a National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation and the Lady Davis Foundation, among others. I'm going to cut this introduction short, and without further ado, I would like to invite Mikhal to take over. And if I can ask all the speakers to please mute their microphones so we can see Mikhal.
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Fatemeh, thank you so much for this great introduction, and such a pleasure and such great company to be in this evening. I'm actually in Israel, so it's night for me, but I guess this afternoon for everybody else. As Fatemeh said, my book, Tehran Children, A Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, follows in the footsteps of roughly 250,000 Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust by fleeing east. And if you look at this map, you can see their route. They begin here in Poland. They flee.
We can't see your page, Mikhal.
Oh.
Perfect.
Yes?
Yes, wonderful. And on your slideshow, if you click on the slideshow and then enter.
Slideshow, yes. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
So we're in the map, and as you can see, these 250,000 refugees, they start here in Nazi-occupied Poland. They're fleeing from Nazi-occupied Poland into the Soviet Union. They are then deported to labor camps in northern Russia or in the Soviet interior. After about 14 months, they are released from labor camps and they continue on to Central Asia, to Kazakhstan, to Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. This is where most of these refugees, Holocaust refugees, stay, and that's where they remain for the duration of the war. A minority of them continues on from Central Asia to Iran. And by the way, some of them do enter through Mashhad. The rest of them enter through the Caspian Sea, through Bandar Pahlavi. And they remain in Iran for some time, continuing on to India, through the Suez Canal, Egypt, and into mandatory Palestine. So this is a 13,000-mile journey. It's a tremendous journey. I tell the story of 250,000 through the story of the one, my father. And this is my father in his Polish hometown of Mousavijad in 1938. This is my father in Tehran in 1942. He's part of a group of Holocaust refugees who are in a Polish tent camp in Tehran. This is 1942. And this is my father in 1944 in a kibbutz, a collective settlement in mandatory Palestine. The story that I tell is, I don't even know if precarity is the right word for it. It's a word of, it's a world or a history of hunted people and of deportations and forced labor camps and extreme starvation. This is what some of the children looked like when they arrived in Tehran. These are children in a hospital in Tehran. It's also a story of children separated from their parents, because the children who continued on to Iran were separated from their parents who remained in Central Asia. But the book, as Fatemeh said, is also about my own search, and in many ways my own precarity as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who didn't really speak about his experience, and who's somebody who's going out into the world to research a story, a Holocaust history that really hasn't been told very much. Now I'm doing this after about 20 years that I'm living in New York, because I was born and raised in Israel, and I live in New York and teach in New York together with Salar, Abdoh, who will be speaking after me. And really this moment when I begin this search is a moment when I'm really questioning my own position, my own sort of voluntary exile in New York. And I'm thinking about the precarity of the refugee as maybe something inherited. So I wanted to share maybe this first excerpt from the introduction, where I write about where I am emotionally and intellectually at the moment when I'm starting this work. The longer I lived in New York, the more I found myself missing life in Israel. Its smells, its blue skies, its beaches at sunset, while increasingly troubled by its politicians and its policies and worried for its future. It wasn't just for Israel, but the whole notion of national belonging and national identity that I was no longer able to take at face value, having adopted, like other students trained in American universities during the 1990s, the political scientist Benedict Anderson's insight that nations were not historic ancient entities, but imagined communities bound together by shared texts, images, and dates on the calendar. Like many doctoral students, I had spent years identifying how such communities were constructed, imagined, manipulated. That model suddenly seemed to me inadequate for understanding my father's refugee experience, or even for making sense of how my own life had turned out. Nations can be a beautiful thing, Salar said, and this is one of our first conversations about this book. And so are national rituals and national belonging, especially when you lose or never had them. It's not that simple, I replied, but I was also grateful for his comment. I wonder if my father had shared his life with friends, with strangers, with people other than us, because he didn't really share it with us, what happened to him during the war with us children or with his family. Dori Laub, a survivor psychiatrist, writes that the absence of empathy in bystanders and fellow victims during the war shaped many Jewish survivors' post-war lives of isolation and friendlessness. I began to wonder whether something like that had always also shaped my father's life, and in turn my own, which had been influenced so profoundly by his detachment. So as Fatemeh said, when I began this journey, in part, it's for me too a journey of reconnecting to the world, and reconnecting to all kinds of parts of the world that I wasn't at all connected with, including the Persianate world where my father ends up being, and my grandparents end up staying in Uzbekistan for the remainder of the war. One of my challenges in writing this book was to simply figure out the questions I need to ask. Because this is, as I said before, this is a story that was not very well known. It's a story of a lot of people, but there was really no roadmap for me. In other words, we know when we think about the Holocaust, we think about the extermination camps in Auschwitz and people in hiding, but we don't really think about the experience in the East. And it took me a long time to, in a way, let go of any preconceived notions and simply just kind of follow my father's life and to recreate his own sense of precarity as somebody who is simply fleeing from something and into the wide world, into a kind of experience where he doesn't know where he'll end up. And he ends up being very, very, very far away, obviously, from where he started. And this is a passage about my method. And so I began very gradually to trace my father's journey from Poland to Iran. I began to follow that odyssey slowly, carefully, without a theory, a model, a roadmap, following the actors, as the sociologist Rogers Brubaker would put it, rather than presupposing anything. I followed the Tehran children. That's how these refugee children are called in Israel, to the Tehran children. I followed the Tehran children, not on a journey from the wretched diaspora to salvation, not from point A to point B, but on a path in which every point of transit could also have been, and often was for others, a point of arrival. I tried to retrace their route as they lived it, looking at each place they had been, teasing out also the could and would have beens. And so again, because I trace it in this way, in this kind of open-ended way, including traveling to many of these places that my father had passed through, being open-ended is also seeing how these refugees interact with local communities and how the refugees are affected by them and how the local communities are affected by the refugees. I also, when I think about precarity in this book, I also think about precarity of cities, cities that are flooded by refugees, for example, Samarkand and Tashkent, but also Tehran at some point, and also ruined cities, cities that end up being ravaged by war, and cities where there is no trace of the refugees, but also no trace of other people who had lived there. One of those cities was my father's hometown in Poland, Mousavijad, where I traveled, and where I go to look for a brewery that was owned by my family for many generations, many generations, that had been in this town for 8 generations. So let me go to the next slide. The title brewery, the title is their family name, was gone. And this is a passage where I list all the things that are gone in this town. Basically everything, all Jewish life is erased from this town. And in its place stood a large, freshly painted middle school whose students were on summer vacation. We walked around the school's grounds. So this is walking around. Salar traveled with me, and also a Polish guide who was kind of telling us everything that was not there, but was there before the war. We walked around the school's grounds looking for traces that weren't there. There was no mention of the brewery or its owners. At the entrance to the schoolyard was a small stone monument. It was carved with the inscription, "This place was sanctified by the martyr bloods of Poles fighting for freedom during the Hitlerite occupation, 1939 to 1944. After your family left," Christoph, the guide, told me, "the Gestapo moved in and the brewery became Gestapo headquarters. When the Nazis retreated in 1944, they blew it up with dynamite. The name of the street where the brewery had stood for 3 generations had been changed from Warsaw to Partizansky Street. The street had been renamed for the partisans who were interrogated and tortured and killed inside the brewery. Also, so basically, this tells the brewery is now, which is now a school, is dedicated to Christian Poles who fought and were interrogated inside the brewery. Ostrov had written a new history for itself, and someone, presumably me, would have to protest it, to fight for the plaque that would hang next to the monument for the martyr blood of the Poles fighting for freedom, and read, "Here stood the Tidal Brothers Brewery, 1856 to 1939. I think some of us in this talk, and this will be my last quote, spoke about also the interesting things or that happened in these modes of precarity or in between states. And one of the interesting things that does happen is when these Polish refugees, Polish Jews, end up in Iran and interact both with just regular Persians, regular Iranians, as well as with the Iranian Jewish community and other Jewish communities in Iran. Because at this point, in 1942, there are German and Austrian and Iraqi Jewish refugees who are all there. One of the most beautiful passages, and this is the last one I'll read, is from the memoir of a Polish rabbi who is in Iran in 1942. It's Yom Kippur, which is the kind of holiest day in the year in Judaism. And he's invited to a makeshift synagogue that was erected by Iraqi Jewish refugee who are also in Tehran. And this is how he describes his experience. At the large courtyard of the Alliance School by the pool, these wealthy Arabs arranged a spot for themselves to pray during high holidays. They spread carpets, brought in lounge and armchairs, a Torah ark, a table for Torah reading, and tents for protection from the sun, and thus a temporary synagogue was erected. For the women, they placed seats in the balconies surrounding the garden so that they too could hear the prayer. I admit that praying in this place left a unique impression on me. There was nothing about it of the atmosphere inside our synagogues during high holidays. No trace of the seriousness, the high-mindedness, the dread, the awe that characterized our prayers. The men, dressed in pressed white suits, sat in half circle around the pool as if they were at a ball in a country club. The cool air, the pools with tiny goldfish, and the tent above only strengthened this impression. Many small children, some of them without a hat, ran around the yard, but did not interrupt the prayer. I sat and thought about what I saw. Perhaps these Baghdadi Jews have preserved Yom Kippur prayer in its original form. Lo hayu yamim tovim leIsrael כ-15 באב ויום Kippur. There were no good days for Israel at the 15th month of Av of Yom Kippur, the Torah says. Perhaps it is appropriate to celebrate Yom Kippur with joyous and happiness, to send flowers to each other, and to act not as slaves dreading their rabbi, but as children who have sinned before their father and know that all will be forgiven. And I quoted this passage, and I write about it in the book because I told you that I went on this journey myself. And I think if a few years back, and if I found this, after the whole research took about 10 years, and I found this towards the end of those 10 years. A few years back, before I began my research, I would have probably thought of this as in a kind of, that this is a European rabbi who is calling these Middle Eastern Jews children who have sinned before their father, as a kind of Orientalist attitude. But because I already knew so much about what this rabbi had been through and what he had suffered, I read the scene in a much different way, in a much more subtler and gentle and more fleeting manner. Because I knew Rabbi Hirschberg was a refugee, because I knew what he had been through and what he and all other refugees lacked. Possessions, connections, family, home, rituals, because he had been robbed of everything. I read his words as longing, as fascination, and as openness to the possibility of a lovely, tranquil presence that overtook the European Orthodox rabbi at that moment. Because above the national and colonial paradigms that shaped the identities of Poles and Jews in Iran hovered the figure of the refugee, a moving figure, homeless, poor, a bit of a tabula rasa. And I will maybe stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhal, for this fabulous presentation. I have to say, reading your book in 2020, last year, really was one of the highlights of my whole year. It's a devastatingly profound and beautifully written piece of literature, not just literature, as I mentioned, also social history. There's so much there that for the reader to learn, especially about a journey that has not been really discussed, as you mentioned. And I was very excited and looking forward to having you and Salar on one panel, because you start the book with basically your encounter and your conversation with Salar, your colleague and your friend in the City College around this idea of Tehran children, and that's how you decide to. I don't know why my video stopped. And that's how you decide to actually go on this journey and write this book. And I'm really grateful to both of you for being present today and to actually engage with each other's work. I'm hoping we can have a conversation after Salar's presentation. And thank you for bringing this new perspective to the precarity of the cities as well as the humans and the life of the refugees. I think that's something that I was really taken. I was really fascinated by when I read your book, that how not only the human bodies but also the cities go through this metamorphosis over time, and the relationship between this urban setting and the bodies. So maybe that's something for us to discuss later. I would like to move on to Salar, our last presenter. And just by a brief description of Salar's book and Salar's work, it's been a pleasure for me to come to know Salar and his work since I immigrated to the United States. So that's one of the highlights of sometimes moving around and not just being stuck in one place, is that you get to meet new people. And Salar has been one of them, part of my American journey. Salar's Out of Mesopotamia, which is this recently published novel, is an unprecedented glimpse into endless war from a Middle Eastern perspective. It's a novel that follows the tradition of the Western canon of martial writers, such as Hemingway and Orwell, to Tim O'Brien and Philip Caputo, but then also subverts and expands upon the genre before completely blowing it apart. Drawing from his first-hand experience of being embedded with Shia militias on the ground in Iraq and in Syria, Abdoh gives agency to the voiceless and the precarious lives of those who are behind the scene of these wars in Iran and beyond, while offering a meditation on war that is moving, humane, darkly funny, and resonantly true. The New York Times book review has described this work as a brilliant, feverish light on the nature of not only modern war, but all war, and even of life itself. And the book list has described this work as a devastatingly profound catch-22 of modern conflict. I highly recommend this work. It really shook my whole understanding. And, I'm closely engaged and sort of informed about how the war in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, has, progressed over the past few years, nearly a decade now. But reading this work was a completely different experience. It's really cathartic and, in a way, groundbreaking in ways that he engages with the precarious life of a war journalist who then travels in between spaces, in between geographies, Iran and Syria and Iraq, and it's constantly in sort of, battle with the idea of peace and war. He shows us how those who live in war-torn geographies get addicted to war, and it becomes really difficult for them to even make peace with the peace when they, when they have an opportunity to do so. So he complicates this dichotomy of peace versus war in ways that, in my view, is unprecedented in Iranian American literature. Salar was born in Iran and splits his time between Tehran and New York City. He is the author of previous novels, also Tehran at Twilight, The Poet Game, and Opium. And he is the editor of Tehran Noir, another collection that I highly recommend. He teaches in the MFA program at the City College of New York, where Mikhal also teaches. And on that note, I will let Salar to share his work with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure this afternoon listening to everybody, learning so much. The last speaker, Mikhal Dekel, we journeyed together for her book quite a bit, and there's much I could tell about that, but I know we're out of time. And I really truly enjoyed everybody, the scholars, the poets. I had chosen a lot of different segments from the novel to read, but I'm just going to read one segment of it because we're out of time. And I will read that, and also I will read my author's statement because I think these two snippets are probably more apt to what we've been talking about today, and I will save us some time. And I will go to it right now. Now I have to learn how to share my screen.
Salar, is that the first excerpt you sent me, or the different? Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
You have, yes, perfect.
Okay. So this is towards the end towards the latter parts of the book, but it'll give you a sense of what the landscape of war looks like and feels like. The countryside was a flat nothingness. Occasionally on parallel dirt roads, a dot moved, and we didn't know if the thing was ours or not. Nothing was taken for granted in victory, because victory had been here before, and it always managed to slip away like fish or happiness. We drove in 3 trucks, hardened men who breathed retribution and the diesel stench of war, and loved it. I sat in front next to the cleric, taking in the murderous smoke of cigarettes that only he and I seemed to not care for. The vehicles putrid with a staleness that is indescribable. If I survived, I would live out my life remembering hours such as this, when breathing seemed pointless. My eyes tried and failed to catch the distances where a drone, a plane, a gunship, an enemy suicide truck, a friendly, or really any motherfucker at all who could spook you out of your melancholy might suddenly emerge. But my eyes were lemons, God-given failures that mostly just guessed at the things men spoke of when they pointed into distances and felt for the placement of their weapons. Names, everywhere there were names. So many combatants and hangers-on and lost souls treading the dying misfortune of Mesopotamia, that one got lost in the maze of titles and martyrs and those waiting in line. I had developed a fear of returning to the places where war was at a respite or non-existent. Though dangerous, Tal Abdoh was still a few kilometers too far away from the action. I would rather go back to our mokab and wait for the enemy to strike again. It would have been suicide on their part to hit us once more, but suicide was their stuff of life, and somehow I held the unreasonable faith that if only I stayed at the mokab long enough, all the dead would return as if they were ghosts on a catwalk. So this was from the book itself, and then I thought, for the sake of time, I'll just read from the author's statement, which sort of explains what I did and why I did it. I had been. Do you have that page now?
Yes.
Okay. I had been working on a film script in Persian, occasionally writing opaque texts on contemporary Middle Eastern art in English, and going to war in Arab lands. The war was around the corner in Iraq and Syria, and always in Afghanistan. It was over our skies in Iran and in the Persian Arab Gulf, where US warships sat perennially waiting. It was in the martyrs I knew personally who were returning in coffins from battles against ISIS, and the survivors of various fronts who hadn't a clue what to do with themselves when they went back home on leave. Usually these men couldn't wait to return to the war. They were lost in peace and did not know what to do with it. Often they talked about martyrdom, the when and how, and sooner or later they went ahead and got themselves killed. I was a part of all this. I had sought it out, not because peace was tedious. In fact, war and its eternal waiting is a lot more tedious. But because this particular war seemed essential to witness, the world I knew was literally a knife's edge away from it. One day, back from the war, I saw men and women sitting in a cafe in downtown Tehran. They were fashionable, beautiful, and oblivious of the horrors taking place just a few hundred miles from them. It was a Friday, which meant it was also art gallery hopping day for them. The words of Marcel Proust about the Great War came to my mind. In the last book of In Search of Lost Time, there's a passage in which the French writer talks about the sting in seeing a veteran on leave walking the streets of Paris and glancing up at the windows of Café Society, where another world, entirely different from what the soldier knows, is in full swing. I was that soldier, but I was also the people inside the cafes of Tehran, and also New York, where I happen to live and work more than half of the year. My multiplicity of worlds was paired with that of the fighters I bunked with, who were enamored of posting online the selfies and videos they took before going into battle and dying hours, sometimes minutes later. Once I decided to write about this staggering absurdity, I knew I could not write about only combat, but rather about the convergence of the precious world of art alongside that of war, in a moment where nothing, not even dying for a just cause, is sacred. It was, to a large measure, a fictionalization of the life I lived over a period of half a decade, but also the lives or combinations of lives of many people I knew, some alive and some no longer. As I wrote this novel of war and art and the life of the writer in a time of war, I was aware of the long shadows of eminences such as Hemingway and Tim O'Brien, whom I have lived with raptly and allude to now and then, while recognizing that my own story comes to the reader from the other side of the lens, so to speak. I write about the men and women whose voices are mostly silenced behind the headlines on Mesopotamia and other killing fields of the Middle East. Yet in doing so, I would like to think that I give voice to that lone soldier whom Proust spoke of 100 years earlier in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salar. This was wonderful, and it really speaks so directly and clearly to the discussions and to the theme of the panel. Thank you for putting everything into perspective from in your beautiful words. And again, I can't recommend this novel more. Please go ahead and order yourself a copy of both of these works that speak to each other also. I think if you decide to read them together, and they will really complement each other. Wonderful. Okay, our Q&A section is open. We have about 10 minutes to ask questions, and the questions first for our two panelists, Mikhal and Salar. If there is any question for them, you can write them in the chat section. And until we start receiving questions, I would like to take the opportunity and ask this question. And the question is for both of you, Mikhal and Salar. It has to do with the internalization of displacement and difference in order to enact a kind of reclamation of the self as somebody who, as you mentioned as you read, Salar, in your statement, and Mikhal, you wrote about this very eloquently in your book, that and this is something that we also read in Hoffman's, for example, Lost in Translation, that displacement, this is a sense that I get from your works, both of your works, and also from what we discussed today, that it seems as if displacement is a thing to strive for, ironically speaking, is a mode of being that help people who live in between the spaces to overcome that very feeling. And I was wondering if you have anything to explain. How do you live with this sense of displacement? How does literature, how does novel, how does writing help you to express and to formulate, to elaborate on those things?
Should I start? I already saved you. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think, I don't remember who said it, but somebody was talking about the fact that you can feel displaced even in your own country. And, in some ways I feel like, I grew up in Israel, and part of growing up in Israel was actually being cut off from everything, from kind of Jewish history that happened before Israel, and especially from this particular history. So in some ways, I grew up in my homeland, so to speak, but I also grew up with a profound sense of that there is something repressed or something that you're being cut off. And so in some ways, ironically, even though I became displaced in New York, and even though I trace a history of displacement, it sort of has made me actually feel more connected. It's certainly more connected to the world and to different pieces of my past, but even ironically more connected to Israel. So I would say that I feel actually after this novel, after this memoir, less displaced. And less cut off, and at the same time I still live in between worlds, so it's just the worlds seem more harmonious, slightly more harmonious, I would say.
Very interesting. Yes, Salar, go ahead, please.
I wrote that, Mikhal, when Mikhal began her work, and at some point when the war started and I went the other direction, but we were in communication. I have an essay that talks about I was coming back to teach from Iraq, and we were both losing people, human beings, families to wars at the time. And she communicated to me, she had lost someone in over there, and I had lost many people. The essay sort of talks about this sense of displacement, and but in general, like when I was in Tehran and going back and forth, there's an ocean of difference between, let's say, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and the United States. But even just a few hundred kilometers between what was going on in Iraq at the time and Tehran, as I note in my author statement, I was quite, part of the art scene for a while there, and I would come and I would see very clueless friends who really didn't care about what's going on, had no idea. They would rather go to their Friday gallery openings, and it really hurt somewhere deep inside. And so that sense of displacement does happen in your own country. It happens in other places. And then in roundabout ways, it manifests itself in weird and interesting ways. I remember Mikhal and I were in Uzbekistan, in the town of Bukhara and Samarkand being two of the cradles of Persian civilization, where a lot of people still speak Persian. And we were in a synagogue, and the rabbi was speaking to me. These are descendants from from 2,000 years ago. They've been there, and he was speaking to me in the Persian of 1,000 years ago, in a classical Persian, which then I related to Mikhal. It was a magical moment that I don't think happens very often in life, and it was also another occasion of displacement that can actually be beautiful and almost a miracle.
Thank you for sort of going back to where we started this conversation 3 hours ago, when I was talking about the artificial boundaries between the Persianate world. You just said it so well that, sometimes you're in Samarkand and Bukhara and you feel more Iranian / Persian / Middle Easterner, or equally so as you are walking in the streets of Tehran, sometimes even more. And that connection, the way that the language and sort of the aesthetics of being and life and thinking connects us sometimes, that goes even beyond the language. I think it's something that is extremely fascinating and interesting. We have about 5 minutes. I know that Abdul Manan has a question. I really was interested to know more about sort of the part where Mikhal writes this book about her father and his journey. And, there is a part in her own re-experiencing of this exodus, which she is also limited. She can't cross the borders in order to go to Iran and to write that sort of important segment of her father's journey. She speaks about this in her book. I wanted to ask her, how did it feel as a writer to actually write about a place, a geography that you never got to experience, never got to see? I think that's an extremely interesting and fascinating term in the spatiality and the sort of the author, of not being in a place and just imagining that journey of the subject, in this case your father. So I'd be interested to know more about that. But before that, I would like to unmute you, Abdul Manan, to ask your question.
Yep.
So we can have all the questions and then perhaps
wonderful. Yeah, I'll just keep it very brief. Thank you so much, Mikhal. It was fabulous. And Salar, good to see you again. I remember we met when you had come to Penn, so it's fabulous to see and hear you again. My question is for the both of us, but really it's interesting as both of you were reading. It's Edward Said. asked something about exile that I think really we should ask. I would want to ask you, and even ask myself sometimes when you write about things like war or occupation. In my case, Kashmir's occupation. It's a big part of what I write about. And also, these are very tragic, in a way, very tragic stories. I mean, wars or occupations or displacements. I mean, they're not just they're not just destructive, but they produce destruction. There's a sense of production of destruction. And Edward Said asked, he asked a very simple but a very important question about thinking about exile. He said that it's strange to me how a tragic thing like exile can produce some of the most beautiful, can be the impetus to produce some of the most beautiful words that I have read. And when I think of that, and when I think of, let's say, Darwish, or when I think of, when I think of Faiz, when I think of Agha Shahid Ali, all these poets, you see that they're writing about such tragic things, and yet, there is that paradox. And the question is, what is the cost of that? Because in my understanding, there is a cost. There is a cost of balancing that paradox. And I just want to know personally, what is the cost of that, or what is the cost of that for the writer or for the scholar? Because I think there is a cost to taking up that active destruction as a mantle to then write something humane.
Salar, maybe you'll start this time.
I think when you write in the framework of displacement, one of which can be exile, and it's not very different than reaching for the beloved that is not present. It's that same sort of madness that exists, and out of it, amazing text, amazing poetry can come out of that longing. But also at the end of the day, you're liable to go a little crazy. I found myself during this period really experiencing things that are, I wouldn't want other people to experience. One of them was the tremendous anger against other human beings who were not in war. I would come. Forget about New York. I would come to Tehran. I would despise all of my friends. I couldn't stand them. They were drinking their cappuccinos and talking about whatever. And then after a while, I realized this is not fair. This is not fair, Salah. You cannot dump this on other people. But not dumping it on them did not mean that I was cleansed. And to this day, I'm not. I think that's the price you pay, and it's the choice you make. The choice. I think Plato, was it in Phaedrus or where was it? He talks about the wings and the wreaths going for the beloved, and it's a beautiful thing, but your wings can get snipped at any time, and even if they don't, you're liable to experience things that are not very pleasant, but you always reach for love.
That really speaks well to your poems, Abdul Manan. Yes, Mikhal.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think, and I don't think I can answer it completely, because in my case, I came to the United States in my 20s. I write I write in English, which is not my native language, but I will say that I couldn't have, I don't think I could have written this book from Israel. So I needed to be away from the kind of somewhat nationalistic, or at least nationhood that framed how I saw the story, in order to write it the way I wrote it, which is really to write it from the beginning to the end, not from the end to the beginning. So it's not, I didn't write it as a story of salvation or like these kids were saved by the Jewish state, but I wrote it from what happens from the moment they leave until the moment they end up there. For that, I needed to be away and far. You know, there was definitely a price for that as well, for sure. A personal price. I think it's good for art, but I don't know if it's such a good thing for at a personal level.
It definitely takes a
Thank you.
toll on many levels of your life. We have run out of time. We have 2 more questions. I wonder how our panelists feel about answering them. I know, Mikhal, you are in Israel, and I know that
I'm happy to.
Okay. Yeah, this, I mean, there's a lot of interest in the talks, and I would like to address them. One of the questions by Sam is that what would you say are the responsibilities of the artists and authors who attempt to fictionalize history and displacement? That's one question. Another question from Taslima is that do you feel like you aren't your identity? You feel like you aren't your identity. Sorry, your identity isn't quote unquote authentic because of your experience with displacement. So these 2 questions. Do you feel quote unquote authentic after being having experienced displacement, or if there is any such thing as authenticity?
Maybe I'll answer the first question first about the commitment to truth, because I think, so in my book, I was very committed to the truth with a capital T, as much as, so in a way I took a kind of non-postmodern route. I mean, I tried to, as much as I could, to get as close as I can to the truth in archives, in memoirs, but looking at every story and testimony from multiple archives and corroborating them, even though I'm not trained as a historian, but and I felt like it was very, very important because, you know, when you write about the past, about history, something that happened 70 years ago, you're not just reaching down a well that's sort of, you know, pure, and then you're sort of reaching for the past and bringing it to the surface. I mean, you're working like an archaeologist. You're sifting through ideologies and through, in my case, through communism and through the Iranian Revolution, all these things that happened after World War II. And of course, I tell a story that gets told completely differently in each one of the countries that I was in. So collective memory is a national memory, and this is a story that's remembered very differently in Poland and in Russia, and somewhat in Iran, and of course in Israel. So I was trying to not be faithful to any of these narratives and try to get to the actual truth of what happened at any given moment. Of course, you know, it's never completely possible, but I do think it's, you know, I'm a little bit ambivalent about fictionalizing the past, and especially fictionalizing something like the Holocaust, because it just gets co-opted very easily afterwards.
I had an interestingly opposite experience from Mikhal, because she was reaching into that past, and I was witness to how she did it so methodically and with such patience. But I, on the other hand, was living it. I was living it. It was a half decade of my life of living it. And as I try to convey, for instance, in the author's statement, you know, a war in the 21st century has such ingredients of absurdity in it because of social media and the access. You know, you can literally be, you know, in battle. I mean, it happened to me more than one time, and then you're on social media, and it's bizarre. And then, you know, you can be in a trench in the morning, be in Tehran in the afternoon, and be in New York City 20 hours later. And this discombobulation and all the things you see, the absolute inhumanity and the amazing humanity that you see. I started out wanting to write actually a nonfiction book, and then I realized I just cannot do it. It's just too much to try to distill all of this into a book of nonfiction. This particular book needs a fiction. It needs fiction to do it justice. So I went the other way.
Wonderful. And then we only have one more question by Illya for Salar, and then we're hoping to close the session. Go ahead, Illya.
Yes. Well, thank you for letting me ask my question at this point. I'm very curious about your writing practice a bit more like in a technical and life experience sense. I'm wondering, I very much admire your writing because it does get very close to human, and it has a very special genuinity that is very admirable for me, Salar. So my question is just, I guess, technical a bit. I'm wondering what is, how you navigate, because I know that you're also an academician, so I wonder how you navigate between all of these various different forms of writing tasks. Do you have specific exercises or rituals that you set for yourself daily or stuff like that?
First of all, I'm a failed poet. All I wanted to do in life is to write poetry like Abdul Bhat there, but I couldn't do it, or Reza. And then I decided at some point to sort of live my life and then let things happen to me. And then I'm also almost an accidental writer, and I'm not making light of this. I live my life, and then I write about them almost as an accident, although I plan things out a little bit too. And I don't feel like, I have to write every day until I have, there are writers who feel like they have to write all the time. I feel like if I have to have something to say, and then when I'm on a project, I wake up in the morning and then work on it. I think the most important thing for me as a writer, the kind of writer I am, and I think Mikhal is too, and just listening to the two poets and, listening to Pamela talk about a lot of the people, the artists that she presented there, I know their work intimately. You go after you. I think for me, and I always tell this to my adjuncts who want to start teaching undergrads, it's all about humanity. It's all about the reaching deep down inside. And even if you're going to write fiction, it has to come from a place of truth, even if it's quote unquote lies. I mean, that's kind of my northern star, my guiding star. And whenever I lose track of that, let's say I'm writing out of anger, okay, out of a sense of revenge, it doesn't work, because then I've displaced myself. All right. And if you work at this long enough, you realize that when you like Faulkner said about your bullshit sensor, you realize like you're doing this for all the wrong reasons, and that's why it's coming out wrong. So you always go to that place of truth. And I think the great poets, I always go back to poetry. I can't write it, but I read it. And some of the poets, the classical Persians that were mentioned here, I always go back to that, and it sort of gives me my center. They give me my center, and once I have my center, I can move on. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Salar. You just beautifully concluded the session that is also part of the advanced seminar on Persian poetry, and I thank you for that, for putting everything in conversation with poetry that speaks to our souls, no matter where we are, who we are, what language we speak, as Reza so beautifully also described it earlier. Thank you everyone for, especially our panelists coming from all corners of the world. One of the silver linings of this pandemic, as much as all of us are fed up with it, really, is that it has created this opportunity of bringing together a group of speakers and, our participants also, that I was keeping an eye on the participants. Thank you, all of you, for staying here, for being patient, and for listening, and for following the discussion. I'm grateful to you all. And again, thanks to Akira and Sophie and Jessica and Zach, our team that made this happen, this session possible from all different, we've been planning for this for months. Those of you who are in this, were in this panel know that a lot of planning went into this. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I wish you luck and I wish you health. And I hope to see you in the real world.
Thank you.
Sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Great meeting everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.